that finishes rib cage. That's everything on rib cage. I just want to make sure. Yeah, that would cover everything you need to know. There's very little questions on that. And okay, so I'm going to do skull. Now I know we tend to spend 1 to 2 classes on skull, but there's maybe 3 questions total. So I'm only going to do the very important stuff with skull. And so basically, those are 2 of the numbers questions. Number of true ribs, total 14. Number of ribs total, everything total 24. And the number question from the vertical column was number of processes, total number of processes on a typical vertebra is what number is that? 7. The total number of features called processes on a typical vertebra, 7. Now, we never ask total number of skull bones because there's differences, but how many cranial bones total is there? The total number of cranial bones is 8. And total number of facial bones? 14. We can't ask total number of skulls. Some books say 8 and 14, 22. Some use the 7 or 30 say 29, so we don't ask that. But we do ask once in a while, total cranial bones is 8, total facial bones 14. And that probably ends the numbers, but now I'm going to be very brief on cranial bones. Frontal bone, just know bone of forehead. So this bone here, frontal bone, there's 1. Bone of forehead, no features it's supraorbital ridge, but we're not asking features on this. I'll come back to sinuses at the end. I'm going to do sinuses once we finish the skull. It won't take too long. So that's frontal bone 1. Parietals, no features. Roof of skull 2. There's 2 parietals. Roof of skull, parietals. The order doesn't matter. It might be a little different in the iPad. I'm doing the easy ones first. Occipital, just know the features of the occipital that you need to know are just 3 names. Foramen magnum, that is in the occipital, transmits spinal cord into cranial cavity. So just know foramen magnum, and then the other important one, occipital condyles, but the name kind of tells you that. Occipital condyles articulate with atlas C1 to form adlenooccipital. Just know, so the occipital condyles articulate with C1 atlas. Occipital condyles articulate with C1 atlas. And once in a while I've seen it, the external occipital protuberance, that big bump at like where the back of your skull, the giant bump dead center, that's where the nuchal ligament starts. External occipital protuberance, big bump. That just is the upper attachment of nuchal ligament is external occipital protuberance. And temporal bones, there are 2. We're not going to ask that, but the temporal bones have a lot of features. The only 2 names that are going to come up are actually 3. Mastoid process, giant bump, but it's not articular. Mastoid process, not articular, but it's a giant bump behind the ear. Now the 2 articular features, zygomatic process articulates suture-wise with zygomatic bone to form zygomatic arch. So zygomatic process of temporal with zygomatic bone forms zygomatic arch. But the big one is mandibula fossa. This concavity articulates with condyle on either side, articulates with condyle of mandible. That's the TMJ, temporal mandibula. Now we're not going to ask category synovial because some books say ellipsoidal but some don't. So we just need to know it's the only movable joints of skull. It's synovial. TMJs, temporal mandibular joints are synovial, but we don't ask category. Just know they're the only synovial or freely movable joints of the skull are the 2 temporal mandibular joints. And the feature of the temporal bone is mandibula fossa. It articulates with the condyle of the mandible, and that's the 2 temporal mandibular joints. Okay, and that finishes everything. I'm being brief, but that's everything you need to know on temporal bone. That's everything for temporal bone. Now for sphenoid and ethmoid, it's name recognition. And there might be, actually I can't think of one, there's no functional questions. It's just name recognition, like which of the following are features of the sphenoid? Which of the following are features of the ethmoid? Like that. So just match the names with the bone. So for sphenoid, there's no function questions on any of these features, so just know greater wings. This is all sphenoid. Oh, keystone bone of cranial floor. Once in a while, only cranial bone that articulates with all the others is sphenoid. The only cranial bone that articulates with all others is the sphenoid. Keystone bone of cranial floor for that reason. And features, greater wings, you don't have to recognize, just know the names. Lesser wings, the body is deeper or more, it's the central portion, I'll come back to that. Then the saddle, sort of on top of it, is sella turcica. So body, sella turcica, forget about foramina. Just know pterygoid plates hang down, they're sphenoid. Tooth-like plates. Those are the only features of the sphenoid not in the cranial floor, but they're pterygoid plates, silent P, pterygoid plates or sphenoid. So greater wings, lesser wings, body, sella turcica, and pterygoid plates. That's it for sphenoid. Just know those names, don't worry about functions, are all sphenoid. For ethmoid, we're not going to ask this, but principal supporting bone of nasal cavity. So ethmoid has everything to do with nasal cavity. And now the names of the features, we're not going to ask any functions, but crista galli and horizontal cruciform plate. So the names of the ethmoid features are crista galli, very old-fashioned, horizontal or cruciform plate. Now the one that's the upper 2/3, I'll do the nasal septum after I finish skull, is perpendicular plate, upper 2/3 nasal septum. Perpendicular plate, upper 2/3 nasal septum. And superior and middle nasal conchae are part of ethmoid. Superior and middle nasal conchae are part of features of ethmoid, but inferior nasal conchae are separate facial bones. I'll do that again. So basically, perpendicular plate ethmoid, superior and middle conchae ethmoid, and the thick lateral portions of the ethmoid that I can't really show here, but they form the side walls are called lateral masses. The lateral masses, the old-fashioned name is labyrinths, but lateral masses of ethmoid are the side walls of ethmoid. And okay, so just know name recognition: crista galli, horizontal plate, perpendicular plate, lateral masses, superior and middle nasal conchae are all ethmoid. It's mainly name recognition. The question is either going to be a sphenoid question, which of the following are part of the sphenoid or features of the sphenoid. It's going to just be match the names with the bone for ethmoid and sphenoid. So just be aware of the names. Don't worry about functions. And then we go for facial bones, it's more of the same. The one that has a lot of features, but we don't really ask much about it. So you just need to know mandible. Now we're on facial bones. Only movable bone of skull via the temporomandibular joint. So lower jawbone, mandible, only movable bone of skull. And it's got a body. It's fused before it burrows, but body and two rami. Body and two rami. But the important thing is that each ramus has two features. The articular feature, the name tells you, condyle, forms the TMJ with the mandibular fossa of the temporal. So the condyle is articular, and the coronoid process is not, it's muscle attachment. We're not going to ask that, but the only articular feature is the condyle, and condyle is always convex, always articular, any bone. So the condyle is the articular feature for the temporal mandibular joint. Coronoid process is not articular. And that's everything for mandible. I'm leaving some stuff out, but it's the lower jawbone, only movable bone of skull. It's the only, okay, I'll leave it like that, only movable bone of the skull. Now the maxillaries, there's one fact, and I'm not really gonna do features, but I'll mention one feature though. So the two maxillary bones, fuse in the midline. They're the upper jaw bones. Two maxillaries are the upper jaw bones, and they're the facial bones that articulate, because they're centrally located, they articulate with all other facial bones except the mandible, because the mandible bypasses them to go back to the temporal. But the two maxillaries, or maxilla, everyone's clear, it's almost the same name, maxillary, maxilla, same thing. They articulate with all facial bones via sutures. All bones of the skull are suture joints except the two synovial TMJs. All the other joints, and I'm going to do joint classification in a couple of minutes, all the other joints of the skull, all joints of the skull are suture joints except the two TMJs. We just need to know freely movable, diaphragmatic, synovial, but don't worry about category. Okay, now the one feature of the maxillaries is that the palatine processes, or you could just say the maxillaries, the two maxillaries, or the two palatine processes of the maxillary form the anterior, this is one fact you should know, the maxillaries form the anterior 3/4 of your hard palate. The maxillaries form, they're painted black here, they form the anterior 3/4 of your hard palate. Maxillaries form anterior 3/4 of the hard palate. That's, besides, they articulate with all skull bones except mandible. Sorry, they articulate with all facial bones. I made a mistake. They articulate with all facial bones, the maxillaries except the mandible. But more importantly, they form, via the palatine processes, the anterior 3/4 of the hard palate. The maxillaries form the anterior 3/4 of the hard palate. And then just know the palatines, separate facial bones, painted gray, form the posterior quarter. No features, just palatines or facial bones, painted gray, that form posterior quarter of the hard palate. Palatines form posterior quarter of the hard palate. And then, no particular order, the rest is just location. Nasal, external nose, two nasal bones, external nose, no features. And lacrimal bones, medial wall of orbit, two, just location, lacrimal bones, located medial wall of orbit. Medial wall of orbit. Zygomatic bones, commonly known as cheekbones, they form the prominence of the cheek, and each zygomatic articulates with zygomatic process of temporal to form zygomatic arch, in case that ever. The question I've seen though, not the zygomatic arch, since that's more palpation and muscle attachment. The standard question is, the zygomatic bone articulates with which other bone? The zygomatic bone articulates with which other bone? A, temporal, B, occipital, C, parietal, D,
temporal.
Yeah, it would be temporal. I was struggling for a good long answer. And so basically, zygomatic bone articulates with zygomatic process of temporal bone. As long as the two names correspond in that way. The zygomatic bone, we don't really list features, but the zygomatic bone articulates with the zygomatic process of the temporal bone. And that's a suture joint, as are all skull joints except TMJs. And then, I said it before, but the inferior nasal conchae are the same function, same location in general as superior and middle conchae, but the superior and middle conchae are part of the ethmoid. They grow as part of the ethmoid, whereas the inferior nasal conchae they suture to the ethmoid, but they grow separate from it, so they're separate facial bones. The inferior nasal conchae are separate facial bones. Just know inferior nasal conchae facial bones. And I think I covered all the facial bones except the vomer. Vomer, singular, forms the inferior third of the nasal septum. The ethmoid forms the superior 2/3 via the perpendicular plate. Perpendicular plate of ethmoid forms the upper 2/3 of the nasal septum, but the vomer forms the inferior third of the nasal septum. That's the only thing about vomer, forms inferior third of nasal septum. And I think that's all facial bones. So any question on facial or cranial bones before I Okay, now, this will sort of recap